welcome everyone. And on behalf of Maggie's, thank you so much for attending our Grief and Bereavement webinar today. And as I mentioned, we're really delighted to have so many different people from different corporate partners. Even if you're not a corporate partner, there's still a real mix of businesses and organizations who have signed up for this webinar today. Many of you will know what Maggie's does, but for those of you who don't know, so Maggie's has 25 years of experience providing free cancer support in centres across the UK. Our first centre was opened in Edinburgh in 1996, and we now have about 24 centres delivering free cancer support to people. We're built in the grounds of NHS hospitals. The centres are really warm and welcoming places where people can access free support that's really needed, run by expert staff to help people live well with cancer. We provide a lot of different services, so people can simply sit down and chat to a cancer support specialist, access one of the many groups that we do, have benefits advice, attend art therapy sessions, sessions with a psychologist, and much more. So we do offer a real breadth of services. And throughout the pandemic, we've also been supporting people over the phone and through Zoom and through Teams like this. So we're funded also by donations, and I know a lot of you are fundraising for Maggie's. So on behalf of us, thank you so much for your continued support of Maggie's. And you can find out about your local centre by visiting our website, maggies.org, if you're not sure where your local one is. So we know that grief and bereavement can affect people in every workplace across the UK. And while it can be difficult to know what to do or to say to a colleague who's going through grief or a bereavement, what we hope to do here today is to give you a deeper understanding of grief and to touch on how to support someone at work. So that's what we're going to explore here today. The session will be delivered by Robin Muir and Ray Owen. Robin is centre head for Maggie's Manchester and consultant clinical psychologist leading a multidisciplinary team, supporting people affected by cancer across Greater Manchester and also working with the Christie's Hospital, which is the largest cancer hospital in Europe. And Ray, we have Ray Owen with us today, which is fantastic. And Ray is a consultant clinical health psychologist with over 30 years of experience in cancer, end of life and bereavement care. He's also external psychology advisor to Maggie's. This webinar is made possible thanks to the continued generosity of players of People's Postcode Lottery, and we're really grateful for all their support. So before I hand over to Robin and Ray, just a few housekeeping rules about the session, and most of you will know them anyway from all of the endless Zoom meetings and Zoom webinars. But just to mention them, the session will be an hour. It'll also be recorded. You should have heard that robotic voice coming on when you joined, just to inform you of that. And it'll be uploaded to the Maggie's YouTube if any of your colleagues have missed the session today and want to watch it back. You will automatically be muted, but you can ask a question in the Q&A box. So do kind of type in your questions into the Q&A chat function, and there will be time for questions at the end. We'll try and get through as many as possible, but if we don't answer your question, we will be sharing some contact details afterwards, so you can get in touch. That's it from me. I don't have any more housekeeping rules, so thank you once again, and I'll hand over to Robin to begin the session.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was really good of you. So yeah, today we are going to talk about grief and bereavement. We'll talk about it both generally and how it can affect somebody within their life, but with this specifically being also about how do we see grief and bereavement arising within the workplace, and how can we support one another in the workplace. We'll go on to talk about how Maggie supports people who are grieving. What's the experience of us that work within our centres? What do we see on a day-to-day basis? What does that tell us about the experience of people who are grieving? And we will conclude by thinking about how can you support those people that you come into contact with through your work who may be bereaved and may be going through a grief process. Jonathan, could you move us on to the next slide, please? I suppose just a note that obviously we are talking about a topic which is very sensitive. There may be people within the group today, who are going through a process of grief and bereavement at the moment, or they may have done so in the past, and the session may arise feelings for any of us. So I think it's just worthwhile reminding us of the potential for this it could upset us. We may experience uncomfortable thoughts or feelings. So important to give ourselves permission as we move through the next hour to just look after ourselves in whatever form that looks like for you. For some people, that might mean, just pausing throughout the session, just taking time away from the screen. The session is going to be recorded, so it's something that you can come back to. But I will trust everybody to do the right things to look after themselves. So I think it's important to sort of remind ourselves that grief can arise in many, many different ways for all of us. It is obviously incredibly related to bereavement, the loss of a loved one through death and dying, but it can arise in lots of other ways as well. Sometimes these can be easier to spot, sometimes they can be a little bit more complex to spot. So the obvious one which arises is when we lose somebody that we love through their death. But other forms that we may also see, particularly in thinking about work, it could be the loss of a colleague, and that might be through bereavement. And we will touch on that today, about what it's like for teams and employers and employees to lose a colleague and how we might manage that. But it might also be about the redundancy of a colleague. It might be about somebody moving on to a new job, restructuring, all the different ways that within a workplace we might lose a relationship, or a relationship might change significantly, and we and the team that we work in may experience a grieving process. It can also be, and I suppose this is where it gets more nuanced and maybe harder to kind of spot for what it is. It might be around the loss of health and wellness, and that's something that we see. That's a daily occurrence for us that work in Maggie's, where people who are facing a cancer diagnosis are losing the health that they have maybe had throughout their lives. The wellness that they have experienced has changed, and they're now experiencing challenges around those things. So that might be issues around mobility, around fatigue, around pain, and that will change what a person can do. And therefore there is a grieving process as they adapt to those challenges. Related to that, being unable to do things in the way that they've once done will change how they see themselves. So it may change their ability to fulfill roles within their lives. So that might be being a parent, a grandparent, a friend to somebody. And it might also affect their identity. So they may do things which define who they are. That could be, the person who is an avid gym goer is no longer able to go to the gym in the same way, and their identity is affected by that. The relationships through which that identity gives them are taken away from them, and therefore again there's a grieving process. And I think probably one of the most nuanced ways that we see grief within Maggie's is the loss of certainty or stability within somebody's life. That's a very, very common theme throughout all cancer, I think. Uncertainty is the biggest thing, or one of the biggest psychological challenges that a person faces. The certainty of health, the certainty of the future, all of those things are maybe taken away from somebody, and therefore there's a big adjustment and adaptation process to living without the certainty that comes with having good health. So there are some of the things that we might experience which might trigger a grieving process within us, but also the people around us. So here's a QR code for the Mentimeter. So if you want to scan that, that will then bring up a link which should take you to the Mentimeter, and the question will be there in front of you. So hopefully that's taking you through to the Mentimeter, and you'll see that the question that we'd like you to think about is, what do you think are some of the feelings that arise due to grief at work? And we'll give you a few minutes to do that, and then we'll bring up the outcome of that. So there we go. And I'd invite Ray to chip in. What we'll do is have a look at this together and just comment on some of the things that have arisen for you already in just thinking about grief and how it might arise in the workplace. Anything that strikes you, Ray, straight away, just seeing all these words moving around.
Well, we see obviously the biggest word and therefore the most central word being sadness. And I guess that's what a lot of us associate with a person who's grieving. But what you're also picking up through, the wisdom of this crowd is the whole range, both of nuances of sadness, loneliness, isolation, down, depressed, but also the other presentations, the anxiety, the anger, and the outright fear that can be as characteristic of grief as a person sad with a tear in their eye.
Absolutely. I think it's some of those really small words that are almost the most interesting to kind of look at. There's one which has really caught my eye, which is embarrassment. It's probably something we'll talk about today, is how we're grieving within a context, because embarrassment is about other people. It's about how we're perceived by the people around us. So that really kind of strikes a chord for me. Of the work that I do with people who are grieving are often have lots of thoughts and feelings about how other people see them as somebody who's bereaved.
Yeah, there's shame in there. I'm sure I saw guilt flash by somewhere.
Pity as well, which I suppose is similar.
Yeah, and it keeps moving, so I keep losing them. But I'm sure I saw apathy, which I thought was a very good catch by someone.
Yeah.
And we'll talk more about some of what might be behind it, but the disengagement from things that would otherwise matter greatly to a person, and that can definitely present as what's the point, can't be bothered anymore, which could show up in any context, including of course in the workplace.
Yeah, there's one which I think is really important for workplace. It's emotional fragility, frailty, is it? Fragility. That, to my mind, again, is about that context, but in the workplace, what it might be like to be somebody who's grieving, and that worry of, can I keep up with everybody? What impact is this thing going to have on me? How will I respond? And then you can see how things like shame and embarrassment might kind of feed into that as we worry. Am I normal? Am I responding in the right way?
What we sometimes see is grief acting as like an emotion amplifier. If you imagine like an amplifier with a gain knob, it's sometimes kind of turned up to 11. So although we're used to seeing high levels of sadness, it could be that something that would normally be a little frustrating makes a person really angry. Something they feel a bit bad about, they feel kind of crippling guilt about. So sometimes it's not all emotions that are driven from within the guilt. It's emotions that are natural responses to the world and events around you, but the intensity of them gets turned up by the fact that a person's grieving.
Absolutely. I'm really happy to, which might seem odd to the audience, but I'm really happy to see anger on there, and anger be big. I think sometimes anger is one of those emotions, not just around grief, but around, I think, a lot of the struggle that we have in life. Sometimes our society tells us that anger is a bad emotion that we shouldn't feel. People can often be cautious around people who are angry because of our worries around aggressiveness, but that's a separate thing. And I think anger is often actually a big part of grieving for very understandable reasons.
And provokes a response in others of distancing, whereas we'll come back to all the difficulty of knowing how to respond, but sometimes sadness provokes a moving towards a person. Sometimes.
Absolutely.
Often anger prompts a moving away from the person, which can of course just intensify some of those other experiences.
And then all of that chatter in your head of, I shouldn't feel this angry about it. All of that stuff that we might get in our minds as well. Well, it looks like there is a real variety of kind of feelings that have arisen in thinking about grief at work. I think all of them are things that sort of ring true for both Ray and I. And as Ray said, what we'll do is we'll come back to these throughout the session to sort of think about how we can think about grief, how we can understand it, and most importantly, I think probably how can we respond to it. both within ourselves when we're grieving, but also with each other. How can we be helpful to ourselves and the people around us when we're grieving as well? So I will now share my screen. Just bear with me. Okay. I presume that that's working. If it's not, if someone could let me know, it would be great. Lovely. Thank you, Ray. So yeah, what Ray and I will do, we'll move through these slides today. I'll take a lead on that, but Ray's also going to chip in. I've said to him he is free to interrupt me with his wisdom whenever he feels he needs to, and I'll try to bring him in as well. So yeah, this is just some notes that I jotted down around what would I perceive as being some of the common challenges of grief, not just within the workplace. I think a lot of the stuff that happens within the workplace, actually, we can extrapolate from, and we can think about our wider society. We probably see similar things. If anything, I think in the workplace, some of that stuff might be kind of, almost to use Ray's analogy, amplified again. Some of those kind of social dynamics become almost more important within the workplace because it's a sensitive environment. One of the big things which comes up is I don't know what to say. So often that's I don't know what to say to somebody who is grieving, who's recently bereaved. And I suppose for my mind, what I hear when people say that is, I don't know what to say to make this better for the person who's in this pain, you know, and I think it therefore reminds me of that empathy that we often feel for people who are grieving, which can feel uncomfortable because we're starting to get a sense of the pain that they're experiencing. It's maybe triggering our own previous grieving experiences, and we want to make it better for that person. But the wisdom that we might have from, you know, working with people who are grieving might tell us that actually we can't accelerate that recovery process. We can't make it better, but that's a bit uncomfortable to see somebody suffering and not be able to have a quick fix or say something that's going to improve the situation for them. What do you think, Ray?
I think I better unmute first. That's the first thing. Yeah. I don't know what to say. Absolutely. And of course, you know, this might be an unfashionable thing to say, but you know, people basically are pretty good and people are basically pretty kind. And the difficulty is their natural reaction sometimes to I don't know what to say is I don't want to say the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And because I don't want to say the wrong thing, I won't say anything. You know, and that's done actually, you know, partly out of personal discomfort, but partly out of a kind of a rationalization of I don't want to hurt this person even further. And the difficulty is that, you know, people who are grieving, just like people who've been diagnosed with cancer actually, will say sometimes the silence around them is one of the hardest bits. The fact that people actively avoid talking about, well, anything with them. So I think that's one of the consequences of that, of that not knowing what to say, that can be really difficult for folks.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to that towards the end of the session to sort of think about how do you, and people who are grieving, negotiate that? How do you find the right path? Because, you know, as the third point on this list says, grief manifests in very different ways between people, and therefore, you know, this session would be really easy if everyone grieved in the same way, because we just start with this is what you need to do, and we'd finish on that. But actually it's that diversity that exists within all of us. You know, when we're bereaved of different people in our life, we'll have a different grieving experience. It's different to grieve for a partner than it is for a parent. And so we can't say you need to do X, Y, and Z. And that makes it, I think, really tricky for people. As Ray was touching on there, it is hard to talk about grief and bereavement and cancer just generally. It can be uncomfortable. We are aware that we perhaps all have some shared experience with this, that we've previously grieved for people, lost people, and therefore we're sensitive to each other, but that can then make these conversations difficult to navigate, and therefore we can feel uncomfortable within them. There are arising emotions within us. One of the challenges, I think, generally is the idea of timescales become important to people. We often are thinking about the future, and we're using the future often to kind of cope with what's happening in the present. And there's a sort of downside to that of what if we don't know what the future holds for us, the uncertainty that comes with grieving. And so timescales, I think, therefore become really important when you're grieving. They can be triggering for difficult emotions. I remember working with somebody who talked about having a friend who, whenever she expressed the person who was bereaved, the pain at losing her partner, this friend would respond and say, the grieving just lasts for 2 years. So you'll be okay when you get to 2 years. And that obviously was a trigger for her as a bereaved person of thinking, that's probably not true, and knowing that it wasn't going to happen. So I think timescales then become quite an emotive thing for people. We want some certainty, but actually what we know is there is no, set what this is going to look like. It's going to differ between different people, and there will probably never be a conclusion or resolution of grief. We won't come to the end of it. How it affects us may change over time, and we hopefully will recover and adapt to having it with us, but it'll still be there. I don't know if you would sort of agree with that, Ray.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. What we often say, grief for a significant loss. I mean, for a very small loss, actually, maybe it just we move past it. But for a very significant loss, grief is effectively a lifelong process. That doesn't mean that it will always be like it is today, but some element of it might be. And I know we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the sort of anniversary effects and things that might bring back higher intensity kind of memories of it. But the idea that it does change us, and we can learn to live well in the presence of that grief, are both true.
And then the final point on that list, just that idea that someone else's grief can trigger our own. So nobody's grieving in a vacuum. We are in some ways all kind of bouncing off each other with our different emotional responses, and somebody else's grief can trigger our feelings about a historical grief and bereavement we've been through. So important to be aware of that. So grief at Maggie's, how do we see it within our centres, and what do we do, I suppose? So where we see grief is in many, many different ways. So, the most clear one is where somebody comes into one of our centres and talks about having recently lost a loved one, which is a very common experience for us, given the nature of what we're doing within the centres. There are a lot of people who are bereaved through cancer who need support to rebuild. But it can also be some of the more nuanced experiences of grief, often within somebody who perhaps has a diagnosis themselves, but also their loved ones. So that might be that loss of health, which I mentioned before. It might be the loss of the future and the plans that somebody had for what they were going to do. So I think one of the really common times you see that is, I think, just given the average age of diagnosis for cancer is around 67, which is unfortunately very similar to a retirement age. And so that kind of very unfortunate picture of somebody who has fairly recently retired or just about to retire and receives a cancer diagnosis. And that turns out all of their plans for retirement on their head. And all of those questions of what am I going to do? How are we going to cope with this arise? It can be the loss of identity. So in terms of work, sometimes that's when people have to temporarily step away from work, permanently step away from work. Then obviously the loss of their identity within work is experienced, so that might be a particular role they've always done. That the classic ones of those around professions where you have a very strong identity. So maybe somebody who's always worked as a nurse, it's not just a job to them, it's a vocation, it's an occupation, and it's a strong part of their identity, of grieving for what it means to that person. Also the loss of functional mobility, so our ability to do stuff on a day-to-day basis and how that affects us and the grieving that needs to occur for those things. And also the loss of relationships. So the impact of cancer can be that we aren't able to attend to relationships in the way that we have done previously, and therefore relationships can be lost. Sometimes that's the discomfort that occurs because of cancer, and it's the example that I think we hear is sort of metaphorically people crossing the road when they see somebody who's affected by cancer. They're not knowing what to say, and then the grieving that's gone through by that person who's affected by cancer at the centre of it as well. So lots of different ways we see grief within Maggie's. We support people who are grieving in many different ways. Our day-to-day work is around the sort of drop-in aspect of the centre, where our cancer support specialists are sitting down with people and having supportive conversations. They're very skilled professionals, often nurses by background, having worked in cancer for often decades. And the big thing which they are doing within those conversations, and this is a theme which we're going to come back to, is acknowledgement of the loss, and then facilitating an expression of thoughts and feelings from the person who's bereaved. That, you know, the cancer support specialists I work with, we have our conversations around how do I support somebody who's grieving is more around how do I help the person who is grieving to start to talk and express their feelings, rather than what can this professional say that's going to make this better for this person. So I think helpful actually to acknowledge that even at a professional level, the big thing that we might offer somebody who's bereaved is our ears. It might be to listen to them. Ways that we are supporting people with grief, we would be looking to, through our bereavement groups, connect people with others who are going through a similar experience. I think that can be really helpful, because often people feel very isolated with grief, and actually to hear other people talk about very similar experiences can be very reassuring. We'll also help people with the practical aspects of grieving. So that can be some of the stuff. We will work with people preemptively. So we're very well placed actually, because we've got people coming in who are having treatments, who are coming towards the end of life, that we are able to preempt some of the challenges that they'll face through will writing, estate planning, appointing funeral directors, thinking about somebody's wishes around end of life care. All of those things will help in the process of bereavement. And then thinking about ways of coping with the emotional impact, some of the program that we offer for people, such as relaxation, being physically active, those sorts of things. So in our centres, we see people who are, when we see people who are bereaved, often they experience the feelings of bereavement as being very overwhelming, particularly in the early stages of grief. If perhaps they have not experienced a significant bereavement before, the feelings which arise can be very, very intense. I think often there is a bit of a pattern that, because of the way that we ritualize grieving, so often through funerals, that the first couple of weeks people are so busy with the practical aspects of grief and bereavement that they're kind of distracted from the emotional aspect. So I think what we'll often see is somebody come in once the funeral's been done, and they're no longer distracted in the same way, and they're starting to fully experience the feelings that they have, and maybe starting to find that actually quite overwhelming, so they're now seeking support. People will often come in, understandably, looking for support that will take those feelings away. I think really important to remind ourselves that we're all human, and put any of us in a situation where we're experiencing feelings which are perceived to be overwhelming or something that we can't cope with, we will then look for ways to find a way out of the feeling, to stop them. That's a challenge because we can't do that within our centres. It is not something that fits our conceptualization of grief. You know, our conceptualization of grief is that people who are grieving are experiencing a very healthy response to a very difficult situation within their life, and that kind of given the right situation and context, that they will achieve a healthy resolution of their grief. But we can't accelerate that, and there's nothing that we can do to make that process kind of come to an end earlier than the healthy grieving. In some ways, using the analogy of maybe somebody who has broken their leg, you have to allow the leg to heal. You have to give it time. You have to protect it. You know, you have to put it in a cast and all of those things because it's vulnerable. Grieving is in some ways similar to that. We tend to see people come into our centre seeking individual support. I think that's probably just around the language that exists around bereavement, and that idea of maybe some of the guilt or embarrassment that people feel about grieving, that actually the idea of being in a group seems quite counter to that. However, within Maggie's, what we do tend to do is run a lot of groups. And there's a number of different reasons why we do that. But our bereavement groups in particular, they are there because our ethos when it comes to bereavement is that we're not here to fix people. As I said, we see people who are grieving as having a very healthy response to a very difficult situation. Our groups, therefore, are about giving them a space to reflect on their grief. The structure of them is that we do 6 90-minute sessions, which we spread over 8 weeks. The people who come along to them are all bereaved through cancer. We have up to 8 people in each group. We don't manage who's in the groups. So the groups which I run are mixed. So you'll have people who are bereaved of parents, partners, siblings, children even. And I actually think that's really helpful, because if we have a single type of relationship, we then kind of hone in just on the sort of thematic and qualitative aspects of that type of grief. But by keeping it broader, we can see more of the wider themes which affect people who are grieving. And because grief is a contextual thing, it's about grieving with the people we love. If I have somebody in one of my groups who is grieving for one of their parents, there may be a surviving parent who has therefore lost a partner. And having a mixed group may help that person to get a better understanding of their surviving parent and what they're experiencing. I think one of the big things about the groups is giving people almost kind of a launch pad, a practice space to think about, starting to talk about their experience of grief, their feelings around it. So that's really what our groups are about. They're definitely not about me standing at the front and telling people what to do. They're about encouraging dialogue between people who are grieving. We'll put in little bits of information to facilitate that process. I often say at the start of my groups that my hope for it is that by the end of it, the group have realized that they don't need me and that to some extent I'm useless. And that's really about them getting much more benefit from each other, the validation, the normalizing that occurs as people start to share their experiences and support one another.
Can I jump in there for a second?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, often, particularly in bereavement work, one-to-one, I guess, as much as group work, I often say I'm like a tugboat. Okay, they're the ship, they're the ones who are making the journey, and the big transatlantic journey. I might be able to help them a bit around some of the rocks in the harbour, give them a little nudge here, but the actual motive power is going to be theirs. And if I stay hitched to them too long, I'm going to slow them down and prevent the journey. So at some point, I've got to cast off and wish them luck and wave them off. And yeah, maybe I or the group or Maggie's can be useful, helping them at the times when the route is a little bit trickier and you need a little bit of a nudge here and there.
That's a really nice metaphor, Ray, and I think it really captures that the work that we're doing around bereavement and grief is often about recovery and moving through those most difficult phases, but getting people to believe in that recovery process, where perhaps I noticed when we did the Mentimeter, confidence was on there. Low confidence is often part of that experience of grieving, and therefore the idea of recovery is often quite an uncomfortable idea because I'm not feeling resilient to that process. I may steal your metaphor though, Ray. So what does our experience of grief at Maggie's tell us more generally about grief? So it is generally unfamiliar to people, I would argue. Within the groups that I do, I'll often talk about this idea that people are less familiar with bereavement and grief than perhaps our society previously would have been. And that's simply, I think, because healthcare has improved so drastically over the last 70 to 100 years that people now, all of us can expect a good, long life. And therefore we experience less bereavement through the course of our life. We therefore start to experience significant bereavements later on and have just less experience with it. I always share an anecdote of mine of working with one of our volunteers in the centre who is now in her 80s, and her talking about her experience of bereavement. She's from Dublin in Ireland, and just when she was a little girl, grief and bereavement being really quite a big part of her life. And so the idea of having to go to a neighbour's house when somebody had died and the body would be laid out in the front room and all of those things. And surprisingly, even though she would do that as a young girl, she had very positive feelings towards grief and bereavement. She felt confident in talking to people who were bereaved because she'd done it from a very young age. And I think that sort of speaks volumes of perhaps where we've come from to where we find ourselves now. So the experience of grieving is therefore less known to most people. So we might, as an individual, find ourselves grieving and be unfamiliar with that process, but also in talking to the people within our own lives, we may be less familiar with what they're going through. And again, it kind of then raises that question of, I don't know what to say to this person. And talking about things which are unfamiliar to us is generally, it's difficult. We'll have less confidence with it. Any thoughts on some of those ideas, Ray?
Yeah, and of course, what goes with the unfamiliarity of it is sort of like a secondary anxiety, an anxiety about it, and that discomfort is again something we naturally draw back from. So you can get this kind of like vicious circle of sort of hanging back, and then that making things feel more awkward. So you hang back some more. So the increased contact with familiarity and the sort of, as we talk about, the normalization of strong emotion, not as an illness, not as a disease, not as something wrong, but as a natural part of loving and living, can only help. And so if we do, and many of us do live within a culture that's distanced us, unlike the person that Robin was talking about, be more familiar with that, just like being more familiar with the process of dying through things like the death cafes movement, I think can only help people in our society.
Absolutely. I think it's one of the things which I try to promote in some of the groups is that people actually go out into their lives and start to have some conversations around their experience of grief, partly because I hope it will be helpful for them, but also it may help the kind of a spreading of a bit more of a narrative around grief and bereavement. So what is grief, this thing that we've talked about for the last half an hour or so? It's a massive umbrella term, that really covers anything that somebody who has lost somebody or something that they hold dear to them experience consistently over time following that loss. So these are just some of the things which we would predict, but what I would say is grief does manifest in many different ways within people's lives. So there'll be things that are not on here that you may have experienced or may have seen in other people. So just some of the emotions, you named many more than I have put on there. And that's simply because, again, so many different emotions can arise. All of those emotions may be things that are happening day to day, but like Ray said, they're amplified and therefore potentially maybe feel a bit more overwhelming. So sadness, anxiety, anger, hopelessness. But I think it's also important to remind ourselves that there are the enjoyable emotions we'll experience as part of a grieving process. And we shouldn't sort of try to keep those two ideas separate. And that's important, I think, because as part of the recovery process of grieving, somebody may start to do something which they find enjoyable as part of that recovery. So that might be going for a meal with friends, or it might be going on a holiday. And they will hopefully experience enjoyment as part of that. Often the first time that happens, they'll then feel guilt immediately afterwards. And they therefore land back in the kind of more negative or unpleasant emotions that we associate with grief. So there's this kind of bouncing between, which we'll come to. But it's important, I think, to therefore remind ourselves that enjoyable emotions are as much a part of the experience of grieving as the unpleasant emotions. Behavior that we might sometimes see people withdraw from life, withdraw from their relationships, those sorts of things. We may see quite the opposite, and people resolutely carrying on. Those people who are concerned perhaps about how other people perceive them and what good grieving looks like. We may see people crying, being visibly upset. That's obviously a kind of common classic thing that we might worry about happening, of what would I do? I will always remind myself when that happens, because I still have that empathy and uncomfortableness if I make somebody cry, that level of emotion was already in that person. I haven't created that sadness. I have just created a space in which it's expressed, which I believe is helpful. And I also believe that crying and people being visibly upset is an act of communication. It's a way that they're telling me that what we're talking about really, really matters. I really value this. And so it's an aid to me in the conversations that I have. So, but I have to remind myself of that, you know, on a regular basis, that when I do make somebody cry, it is as part of trying to be helpful to them and being compassionate, so that I can help myself with some of that uncomfortableness. Thoughts that people might experience, memories, thinking about the future, dealing with the practical aspects of bereavement, that kind of planning things that might be going through our head. Health actually is really impacted by grief and bereavement. We know that people are at higher risk of health problems when they're bereaved of a significant person. Often that's a partner. Those people are at increased risk of a number of different types of health problems. People will also experience things like poor sleep, poor appetite, increased use of substances, alcohol, as a means of coping. So there's lots of different things that we may see when somebody's grieving. Is there anything that you want to chip in, Ray?
Only to say that apart from the behaviour there, which we can see in another person, got to remember all those other things, emotions, thoughts, and health, are kind of invisible. They're happening within the person. So the person who may experience them strongly, they may not be visible from the outside. And there's a reason for pointing this out. And that reason is people often feel that they personally are dealing far less well with their grief than Mrs. Smith down the road who lost her husband only 3 weeks ago. And they don't get to see Mrs. Smith in floods of tears at 2 o'clock in the morning. They only get to see Mrs. Smith when she's painted her face on and she's holding it together to go down the shops. So just remembering, we have a phrase sometimes that we compare our insides to other people's outsides. And sometimes it's not a fair comparison.
Thank you. So, grieving as a healthy response, I've touched on this already, but I think it is important to remind ourselves of what grieving is and to try to see it actually as a healthy response to a very difficult thing which is happening in somebody's life. Grieving is often actually occurring with other people. I think because it's something which makes us feel uncomfortable, we often then try to do it alone. We might isolate ourselves from other people, disconnect, those sorts of things. We might worry about the impact that our emotions have on other people. So you often hear families will do that and talk about wearing a mask. I don't want to tell my daughter how I feel because it might make her feel bad. And actually, I think what is then happening is cutting people off from a really valuable resource around grief, which is the people that they love and that love them. So families, friends, teams, work colleagues, those sorts of things. And so having those things, I think, helps people to have a much more healthy grieving process. That can look like people talking about the person who's been lost, talking about the impact on them, and also talking about recovery and how they're moving forwards. And if we're able to talk about our feelings of grief and bereavement, what that's doing is it's giving us acknowledgement of what we're going through, all those thoughts, feelings, behaviors, that sort of stuff. It facilitates understanding both in the person who is grieving and the person around them, which then helps adaptation for both parties. And it also, I think, really helps emotions to be expressed, and thoughts as well. And again, that being really helpful to actually just get a good sense of what's going on for me. You know, part of grieving is becoming familiar with the patterns of grief that an individual experiences, because then you're able to respond rather than react to those thoughts and feelings. Often initially, people, when they are overwhelmed, what's happening is the thoughts and feelings they have, they're just reacting to them rather than responding to them based on how they want to be within their life when they are grieving, what's going to help them. So often talking about it with other people, whether they're professionals or non-professionals, helps in that process of identifying the patterns and what will be a helpful response. We think about grief as being kind of two processes. One is this process of loss, where we are developing a narrative around the loss that's occurred. The feelings that we associate with that are often sadness, those kind of classic emotions. That's the picture, that sort of classic picture of somebody who's grieving, who might be crying, experiencing sadness, anxiety, anger, that sort of stuff. It's when they're connecting with the loss that they've experienced. The other side is the adapting process, and this is the part of grieving which I think is often less familiar to people, less talked about, and can actually cause some more uncomfortable emotions. And that's the process of adapting or recovery. And this is where, because losing somebody or something creates an absence, then there's a need for us to then accommodate or adjust to that absence within our life. So that might be taking on new roles. So a classic example of that is where somebody loses a partner. So I had somebody I was supporting recently. She'd been married for 50 years, in her 70s. Classic relationship in terms of their sort of what they did around the house. He did all the DIY, took care of stuff. The boiler breaks. And so her first feeling is lots of swear words of, and why is he not here? And, all that anger stuff arising. And then her having to move into the adapting process of thinking, well, how am I going to fix the boiler? What am I going to do? And actually then going and having to do that. And that then creates other feelings. She was able to do that. So then actually out of that process arises this feeling of pride, but it's also tinged with anger, because I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't feel happy that I've been able to do this. I don't want to be independent of him. I liked our dependence upon each other. And so we have these two processes which actually are working kind of together, but often triggering each other. Which is shown in this sort of image of what grieving is like. So you can see in this image, grief is sort of portrayed as being this grief swing, where we have a person who is on the swing, moving between these two different islands. The one on the left-hand side is the land of loss. So that's where somebody is feeling sad. They are developing a narrative around the loss. They're thinking about how it happened. Is there something different I could have done? Feelings of regret or guilt. But then equally, there's this other side, the land of rebuilding, where somebody is looking to the future and looking to recovery. And healthy grieving is about actually being on that swing and moving between these two different islands. Now, over the process of grieving, that movement changes. And what I would say some kind of common patterns we might see is earlier on in grief, somebody's more likely to spend more time in the land of the loss. And over time, they probably spend more time in the land of rebuilding. Over time, the movement between the two lands perhaps slows down, maybe becomes a little bit more predictable, albeit that the movement never ever stops. There are then some patterns around how people get stuck. So often that's where somebody may get stuck on the loss side because rebuilding feels too difficult for them, maybe because of feelings of guilt or worries about how they're perceived by other people. Or you may have somebody who gets stuck on the land of rebuilding, often because the loss stuff feels far too intense and overwhelming. And so they do things to distract themselves by carrying on, getting on with things. Any thoughts, Ray?
Only very briefly to say that, lots of us who work in this field find this a more helpful way of talking about how things move over time than the thing that's perhaps more familiar in popular culture, the idea that there is a set of phases and you start off with shock and numbness and then you move to anger and then you move to, there's good stuff within that, but most people aren't like that. Lots of us are like this, so this tends to be a more useful explanation.
So I'm aware of time, so we'll try and move as quickly but as we can, but also try and cover everything as well as we can. So how we might see grief arising in the workplace. So that might be an individual within the team experiencing grief, so personal loss or bereavement, but it might also be that you have a work team experiencing a work-based loss or bereavement. So that might be around a colleague leaving a team restructure, the death of a colleague, those sorts of things. So we'll think about both of these things now. So some of the challenges of grief within the workplace. Virtual ways of working, I think, is something where virtual ways of working tend to intensify contact with people. They reduce the opportunity for more relaxed and informal interaction. So I think that's important to be aware of how does that then further intensify conversations about grief and bereavement. One challenge is that grief doesn't always fit well into existing approaches to HR, which might be predominantly based upon physical health, where we have a much more classic model of ill health, as in somebody is diagnosed, they hopefully have treatment, that makes them better, and they recover back into the workplace. Whereas grief it doesn't act like that. It is a recovery process, but one which is not straightforwardly linear. It has peaks and troughs in it, anniversaries, birthdays, reminders. All of these things mean that while somebody might be, at 9:30 in the morning, absolutely fine and feeling really resilient, by 10:30, something's happened and now they're feeling completely unresilient and unable to cope and need to step away. One complexity is that diversity in experience, and that different colleagues will require different support. For some people, and it depends on the work that somebody does as well, some people find that work is a really good way to help support their grieving. It helps them to do recovery, it gives them something else, it gives them meaning. Whereas other people, their work may be a trigger for their emotions, and it may be sort of unrealistic for them to be able to work. Also, work is an important social space for a lot of us. It's where we spend a lot of our time. It's where we have some of our most intense relationships. Those relationships can be very important to support healthy grieving, but obviously the workplace is first and foremost a place of work. And so it's important that we find the balance in moving towards the aims of our work and our employers and ourselves, but also our needs as individuals to be healthy, to recover well, and finding that right balance for each person. Supporting an individual team member, I've talked a lot already about important to acknowledge that individual's experience of grief. So not approaching them with a preconceived idea, perhaps from personal experience or the experience of somebody else within a team. Giving that person your ears, tell me what you're going through. Seeing and talking about grief as a process of adaptation and adjustment, as a recovery process, but also one that's not simply linear. There are these ups and downs that we can expect. Some of them will be predictable, some of them will be completely unpredictable, but we might plan for them nonetheless. What will we do when you get to your anniversary of the death? What will we do if somebody else in the team becomes unwell? Those sorts of things. Consider the challenges that grieving experiences creates at work. So it might be adapting work to those challenges. That might be somebody who does work which is related to something which triggers their grief. It might be also about putting things in place for support. So that might be about access to psychological support, agreed regular catch-ups, having somebody within the team who's a named contact for them, putting boundaries around conversations as well. And that can be really helpful for people who are bereaved, who don't want sort of unsolicited conversations at the kettle. That they might want to say, we're only going to talk about it at this time in this place, and that being agreed. And then sort of a wider point which is related to that, how does this person want the team to relate to them? So I would argue the team can be really valuable to a person who's grieving, but it's important that the team gets that right. There will be some people who do not want to talk to their colleagues about their grief, and that's okay. There'll be others that really do want to talk about it and want it acknowledged and that sort of stuff, and there'll be people in the middle. But again, it's only by listening to that person that we'll find out what's going to work for them. Supporting a team, I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges we can face within our workplaces. It may be that managers and team leaders need the support of HR colleagues when a team is grieving, to think about what are the processes that are going on and how do we support that team. Some of the principles are very similar though. Acknowledgement, I think, is the best starting point when this is happening. Finding out what's happening for each individual within a team, but also, if it's possible, having a team sit down together to acknowledge the loss that they've been through, to give them a space to talk about what's arising for them, to talk about the person as well. That can be really helpful, really important stuff to do. often we do that more naturally in our personal lives. We have rituals, funerals, wakes, all of those things to help us with that stuff. Within a workplace, we might not have access to that, and particularly not to do it as a team. Be aware that a team loss may trigger an emotional response that relates to a particular individual's experience. So somebody who's had previous bereavement, this bereavement may then trigger their feelings about that. And so you may actually have two experiences of grieving happening at once that might need to be, that person might need extra support. Give team members the opportunity to grieve together. So time to talk about the person, share memories, discuss with the team members how you as a team can rebuild. So introducing that idea about adaptation, adjusting to the loss, those sorts of things. And one of the most important things as a leader within my own team is to be modeling, and to, I think in some ways as a leader, you are a bit like a parent to a team, and good kind of emotional resilience tells us that we will often look to the leaders in our lives, our parents, our managers at work, to look at them to how they're responding, and we will then respond in a similar way. So what we probably don't want is a team leader who keeps everything to themselves and pretends that they're absolutely fine. What we would perhaps suggest doing is being open about your own feelings and ways of managing the impact of grief. Now, obviously, there's a fine balance with that. If you're feeling quite overwhelmed by those feelings, you might not want to go into the full detail of that with the people that you are managing and leading. But finding a balance between those two positions whilst getting the support that you need from your manager, your leader, the people that support you in your role, would hopefully help you to do that. And that might be where HR come in. Anything going through your mind, Ray? Oh, lovely. So we will now come on to the Q&A. So I can see we've already got some questions.
Thank you so much, Robin and Ray. Also, I know Ray's been beavering away in the Q&A box, so that's absolutely fantastic.
Thank you, Ray.
Providing his written responses, which is fantastic to see. I know a few things have come in in the last couple of minutes. So one attendee said, from my recent experience, I was using work as a distraction, but not processing my emotions, and ended up having a mental breakdown. I found it very useful to cry it out with a person who I didn't personally know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that rings such a chord with me through my clinical work. Often, that's being on the island of recovery, isn't it? And actually recognizing there is value in getting onto that other side where we might cry and express stuff.
Yeah.
And what I would add to that, and having it was similar to something I put in another response, is also remember that people might do that within their working day. They might actually, when they're in the privacy of their own home, be going through photo albums, allowing themselves to cry, have other social support networks. So from the outside, we can't judge the fact that a person's clearly diving into their work. We need to wonder, I wonder at what cost, but we can't prejudge that that's necessarily a bad thing for them. We would need to, if we felt we have the position, we have the skills, gently explore with them whether they were able to address the other side of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question, how do you create boundaries around grief? I found it extremely difficult being at work since the loss of my father. And I think for me, that's one where actually, so I supported somebody who came along to one of our groups who I kind of talked him through that idea of the swing and the island. And he took that away with him and he put it on his fridge. Next week, he came back and he talked about how what he was doing was every day was going to that and reflecting on where he'd been during the day so far. And then thinking, what would get me to do stuff on the other side? So if he had been at work, he would then sit down and look at, with a cup of tea, a nice environment, sit down and look at photos of his wife and think about it. But equally, if he'd been doing lost stuff already, he'd then think to himself, well, what can I do which is more centered on my recovery? So they might contact a friend and go for a walk. He might go to the gym. And I think that was a really interesting idea about how we might respond to what we're doing, which then, whilst it isn't going to create a boundary, what I think it does is it allows a more kind of healthy movement between the two. Because I think that's probably what you're sort of suggesting is feeling overwhelmed by the extremeness of the swing And I think that happens when we're not moving between them perhaps often as we could do. And so promoting a bit more movement between the two can help that it maybe feels slightly less overwhelming, and also we feel we've got a bit more control over it.
Thank you. I think before we close today, maybe one last question. There's a question around boundaries and how you create them, which you spoke to, but also about kind of having, as a team leader, how you balance getting support, being open, and maintaining respective leadership. So how do we kind of create those boundaries whilst wanting to kind of remain open and getting that support, maybe as a team leader?
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was touching on, is that tension between those two positions and it being hard to find that balance. I mean, I would be keen if it, I mean, I have been in that position as a team leader of our team, having lost somebody through bereavement. And I think what was important for me in the first instance was connecting with the people that support me in my workplace, so my team leader and other people who are sort of more senior than I am, but then being able to sort of plan, how am I going to break the news to the team? How are we going to talk about it? What do I want to say? How open can I be with them? So it's sort of making sure my own emotional needs were being taken care of so that I could take care of them for other people, and doing a little bit of planning. And then probably if you have people within the team that you trust, maybe somebody who deputizes for you, who you can kind of seek feedback from and say, have I got the balance right there? What's the temperature of the team? How's that gone down? Might be helpful.
Could I also quickly add, the whole process that we're talking about here of actually looking at grief, not treating grief as one big fog or one big soup, also saying, what was the loss? What are the thoughts? What are the feelings? What are the reactions? Being able to be that sort of almost matter of fact about it can really help in that situation. We can acknowledge people's pain, but also be able then to have a conversation of, this might affect people's concentration. This might mean, you know, they need the capacity for 10 minutes time out to go and sort themselves out. And being able to talk about it in those realistic terms, not as a thing of shame or it's not an illness, it's not a mental illness, it's just part of living and loving. But if we can talk about the practicalities of it within the workplace, then we are more able to manage it within it without losing respect, in fact, hopefully gaining respect by being able to talk about even these most difficult of things.
Absolutely. I mean, I always find it helpful with my own manager. She will be kind of go further than perhaps I need, you know, and sort of say, you know, look after yourself, take time now. And actually, I think that's really helpful, at that kind of perhaps going past where you think the person in your team needs, which then gives them a bit of opportunity to do what they need to do. But you'll probably get some reciprocation in that they will actually be better sooner. So it kind of works well for both parties.
Great, thank you so much. We've also got some great comments saying that it's reassuring to hear that a lot of what Nia's feeling is normal patterns of grief after her bereavement. And also Fred mentioning how a phased return to work can help people start to gain a normal routine. So thank you all for all of your kind of questions and comments. It's been really great to have you engaged in the session and asking these questions. I'll send out an email with the link to the recording. If you do have any questions, I'm more than happy to share contact details so you can get in touch with our panelists. But thank you very much for attending, and a reminder that a short feedback survey is going to launch. We'd like to get your thoughts on what you'd like to see next, and if you enjoyed the session. But a big thank you to Robin and Ray for joining us on this panel today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.